This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. It seems like Kansas overnight has began experiencing far cooler temperatures. With that in mind, I was joined by two K-State agents from across the state to provide updates on current wheat conditions in their areas. Also ahead, K-State range scientist Keith Harmoney recently did a deep dive on research dating back to even the 1930s, looking at the impacts of different instances of drought in Kansas on forage, and gleans advice away from that data for producers to implement now to better prepare for and endure drought conditions. For many, the holidays are symbolized by the Christmas tree. For some, it's an artificial tree, and for others, it's a trip to a local tree farm. If you're getting a live tree, K-State forester Charlie Barden says that there are several things to consider. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We're starting today's programming with insight from two individuals from across the state of Kansas with a wheat update for this growing season so far. We'll continue on with our two conversations ahead from our two guests from Sedgwick County and the far northwestern part of Kansas. We are back now with Jeff Seiler. He is a K-State Extension Agriculture agent for Sedgwick County, and he's joining us today for a current update on their wheat production in Sedgwick County. So, Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking through a bit of a wheat update. I know it seems like not too long ago everything was getting planted. So what did planting look like in Sedgwick County this year? Was it about the same percentage as usual?
Yeah, so typically we're going pretty heavy with our planting those first couple weeks of October. And we did have a number of fields that were planted in that time period. But just with the lack of moisture, I think that we had a lot of farmers that weren't as much in a hurry to get out there and get that wheat in there. The wheat that was planted, a lot of it just sat there, maybe a few spots came up. But just the lack of moisture had guys waiting to see if we could catch some moisture to have a little better prospects when they planted. We did catch a rain on October 24th, anywhere from 0.3 to about an inch across the county. That really got a lot of guys going. That plus the incoming insurance date cutoff. So we saw a lot of wheat planted there on that back half October into early November.
With that, I know it hasn't been planted in the ground for that long, but in terms of emergence, what all have you guys seen in Sedgwick County so far?
November 4th, we had a really good rain. Across the county, I think most of us caught 2 inches. There might have been a portion in the southwest part of the county that was inch and 6/10, maybe, according to Coco Ross. After that, things really changed for us. Before, we had a lot of fields that hadn't even emerged at all, or if they had, they were very spotty. Since then, I was out yesterday, and we have a lot more fields that are very uniform. There's not a lot of growth on them. Some of them are barely just emerged. Some of them might have a leaf or two. It's rare that you see much of it that's tillered very well. But that early November rain really helped with our emergence and make some of these fields look a little more uniform out there. It's nice to see some green actually coming up.
Jeff, in light of recent challenges with everything going on this year and heading into this growing season, is there anything that producers have really in your area done differently this year?
I would say they have. Along with that, maybe delaying the planting date, there's been some farmers that have elected not to put on a starter fertilizer just because there's such low soil moisture. The prospects of having a good crop and getting something established weren't very good. So those guys were holding off until around topter, I think, to make those nitrogen decisions. Absolutely.
So putting off that nitrogen application, like you said, saving some costs there up front to hopefully better utilize it later on.
Yep, because if we wouldn't have got any moisture, don't even have a crop, there's no reason to go and put your nitrogen out there and have it susceptible to losses.
Absolutely. Good to know for sure. Colder temps quickly approaching and already here for most of the state. Are you concerned any about getting a good stand prior to some of those freezing temps?
Yeah, and it would be fantastic if we could have caught, 2 or 3 weeks of 60-degree mild weather where we could get this wheat going, get it a little more growth, get some more leaf development, and put on a few tillers. I don't know if we're going to get that. Ideally, to get to your maximum cold hardiness, you want that, 3-4 leaves with a couple tillers. I've talked with a few guys that have said, they've seen it emerge or just sit in the ground for a long time, even with the seed slot open and not seen any cold damage. So we'll have to wait and see. I'm a little concerned, but we've seen it before where we haven't had any issues. So
absolutely. Here's hoping for sure. And speaking of freezing temps and precipitation, really, you mentioned that you guys got a good soaking on November 4th. Did you guys happen to catch any of the snow that we got today as we're recording this?
Yeah, right now on the ground, we have I would call it a light dusting. It won't amount to much moisture overall, but it's nice to see any moisture when we're stuck in this drought.
Hopefully a little bit of an impact there. But in terms of anything coming up, I guess moisture is the main concern, but any other anticipated issues this growing season?
No, and like you said, moisture is our biggest concern. It's going to be our most limiting factor every year, and right now we don't have enough of it, especially in our fields that are coming after corn or soybeans. And those double crop fields, just the soil profile isn't full, and that's going to be a concern growing forward. I think that rain back on November 4th, it's going to carry us for a while. It got a nice soaking up top, but just in those double crops, I don't think we have the soil profile and moisture. I was out yesterday and probed a field that's wheat coming after wheat, probed down 18 inches, and it had pretty good moisture. So I'm happy with that. If you have a field coming after wheat on wheat, then I think you're sitting a lot better moisture-wise.
Excellent. Good to know for sure. And thank you so much, Jeff, again, for this update on Sedgwick County.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Jeff Seiler. He is an extension agent in Sedgwick County, providing a wheat update for them. We are back now, joined by Jeanne Falk Jones. She's a K-State multi-county agronomist, but she mostly deals with the far northwest of Kansas. So, Jeanne, thank you so much for joining us and providing an update.
Oh, happy to do so.
Let's start with just planting. What really did you see in the counties that you cover this year? Was there the same amount as usual planted or time frame adjustments in terms of planting dates?
I think I would say we probably have as much wheat going in the ground as we have for the last several years. I do think our structure on when we were getting it in the ground has changed a little bit, and that was really driven by when we had moisture. So in some cases, we pushed those drilling dates. Typically, we would talk about the 15th, 20th, 25th of September timeframe to get started, and we were pushing that probably a week earlier than we typically would, and that was very much driven by the fact that there was moisture in that top 4 inches at that point. However, we continued to drill all through our typical drilling time, and then as our summer crops were coming off some of this irrigated ground, we were drilling some wheat back into some of that. Even some of the fields that we had corn or milo that droughted out. In some cases, there was some wheat drilled back into some of those fields, especially the ones that were taken for silage. And so a little bit different structure, I think, on how we were drilling wheat this year. But I would say we really kind of had our regular drilling time, just maybe pushed it forward just about a week or so.
Weird year for a lot of folks, but kind of at the point now in the year where things are rapidly getting colder and we start worrying about if we've had a good emergence rate and things like that. So what does that look like so far in your counties?
We have kind of a mixed bag on how well wheat emerged. We have some fields that there was moisture. They maybe were under the shower that came through and had a little bit of moisture to actually get wheat emerged and have a pretty decent cover on some of those fields. And then you can actually just move not very far down the road and have poorer drilling conditions where we didn't have as much moisture. And then we also have fields basically have no emergence. There's been wheat drilled into them, but hasn't emerged yet. And on some of those fields, I always tell guys when I get phone calls about these fields, and I've actually stopped and done it, is to dig down there and see really what that seed looks like. First, has it imbibed or taken in the moisture, and then has it germinated? Because the question I sometimes get is, will our wheat vernalize? And, vernalization is basically when that wheat plant switches from being a vegetative plant to knowing that it is time to become a reproductive plant. And that happens during those cool temperatures during the winter. But it has to germinate in order for it to go through vernalization. And so that's an important thing to stop and think through on some of that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm sure you've gotten various questions from producers that are concerned saying, I don't think I've got a good enough standing before we go into these winter months for that process to actually take place. So addressing some of those concerns, is there anything that producers out there that didn't get a good emergence, anything that they should know?
I think it really goes back to going out and digging to see what that seed looks like out there in the field. And then, let's talk about stands first. Our stands could be very thin when we have late emergence on this. And so at that point, we're really relying on those spring tillers to kind of help fill back in some of that poor stand. But we need spring productive tillers, and that's when they switch to reproductive mode. So it has to go through vernalization, and that actually is just a time where we have cooler temperatures. And the time frame for vernalization really depends upon the wheat variety, and it can take anywhere from 2 to 8 weeks, and it's when we get below 50 degrees is when that starts to happen. And cool, moist conditions in the spring really help those spring tillers be very productive tillers. Dry, hot weather is not very conducive for those spring tillers to really kick into gear and help contribute to yield, because we know when we have this late emerging wheat that we can, and most times, have lower yield potential just because we don't have as many fall tillers on those plants to help contribute to yield. So it's an interaction of getting those fall tillers, and then we want productive spring tillers to really help fill in when we have thinner stands or poor emergence in the fall.
Something key to keep in mind for sure. In terms of some other issues, obviously the biggest one for your area probably is just the lack of precipitation that you guys have received this fall. Is that right?
I would say yes. That's our number one concern out here right now is that we would take any kind of moisture that we can get our hands on out here. I know the rest of the state was lucky enough to catch some snow the last couple of days. We haven't been that lucky out in Northwest, and so we would really love to have some moisture because that's our concern.
Well, Janie, I can't thank you enough for this update. I really do appreciate it.
I appreciate being asked to be on the show today.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Jeanne Falk Jones. She is a K-State multi-county agronomist, and she covers the far northwest area of Kansas, providing a wheat update for that area. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now and joined by Keith Harmoney. He is a K-State range scientist. He's joining us today for a conversation on learning from past droughts, even back to the 1930s and 50s. So, Keith, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I'm glad to be with you today.
Glad to have you. So, like I said, this discussion we're having today, you were asked about how the 2022 drought will affect forage growth in 2023. And this inspired you to kind of go down a rabbit hole of looking at past data of studies conducted at the Hayes Research Center. And that first data set that you looked back at was dated back to 1956. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, that year, 1956, was the actual year with the driest rainfall total on record here at our Hayes Ag Research Center. And that year was actually in the middle of a long-term grazing study that occurred from the 1940s to the 1960s. And in that grazing study, they were looking at 3 different stocking rates: a light stocking rate, a moderate stocking rate, and a heavy stocking rate. And so that dry period of the mid-1950s occurred right in the middle of that study. And so that drought year of 1956 is basically a landmark as being the lowest total that we've recorded at the research center here at Hayes. And we've had, since those early 1940s, we've had almost 80 years of production data on pastures and linking that with weather. And so that time period in the 1950s is pretty critical for us to look back and to see what happened. But anyway, that 1956 year, as I mentioned, was our driest year on record. And it coincided with our driest pasture yield that we recorded at our Ag Research Center. So those two went hand in hand, as you expect that they might. But I was asked about, what the drought of this year, how is it going to affect growth next year? So I looked back at that very severe drought year of 1956 and looked at what happened then in 1957. And in 1957, we had above average precipitation return at Hayes. So what I looked at then was, what were those yields that year in 1957 after we had that extreme drought in 1956? And what occurred was we had above average production in every single one of our treatment pastures following that drought year of 1956. So even though we had our driest year on record, the prior year, we were able to get yields that were above average the next year because we had above average precipitation return.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we're all hoping for that, hopefully in 2023. I guess the jury's still out on that one, whether or not we'll see the same kind of precipitation levels and things of that nature come 2023 here in Kansas. But you also, in that 1956 study, the following year, 1957, you coincided that with kind of comparing the stocking rates, right? Was it clear across all stocking rates, those different pastures that you were using for that research? Were they all above record yields?
They weren't above record yields, but they were above average yields that following year. We had above average precipitation in 1957, and all of our stocking rate treatments had above average yields in 1957. Now, the level of those yields were basically determined by prior use or history of those pastures. The moderate stock pasture had higher production than the heavy stock pasture, and the light stock pastures had greater production than the moderate stock pastures. So it was the precipitation that we received in 1957 that determined whether or not we would have above average yields or not. But it was the prior use that determined what the ceiling or limit of that yield was. So prior use is important for determining what the yield potential is going to be for any particular pasture based on their region and the soils that they have.
I mean, that stands for any year. That wasn't just that year that you saw those stocking rate impacts. It goes for even hopefully what we'll see in 2023 as well. So if producers have been managing stocking rates well, they can hope if we get significant precipitation or just enough precipitation in 2023 that we'll see the yields that kind of correspond with that, similar to 1957, right?
Yeah, prior history will have an effect on what we see in yields the next year. Now, I had mentioned we have 80 years worth of records of pasture production data and weather data. And in looking at those more closely, I've basically found that the precipitation that we receive in April, May, and June of a year are the main determinants or are the best predictors of how much production we will have at the end of that season. So one thing that producers can do is that they can track their precipitation that they receive in April, May, and June and use the end of each one of those months as sort of a trigger time period to determine whether or not they should start implementing some sort of a drought plan that they have for their pastures. So, yeah, what we see in 2023 is going to be largely determined by the amount of precip that we receive in April, May, and June. And one thing I want to point out is that in that 1956 year, the April, May, and June precipitation was about 3 inches combined of total precip. And in 1957, it was about 12 inches, or a little over 12 inches, 4 times the amount. And the amount of production that was produced in 1957 was about 4 times the yield that was received in 1956. So that April, May, and June time period is really critical for determining how much forage production we're going to have at the end of the season.
Key to keep in mind for sure as producers are thinking ahead and looking to see what we get next year and kind of what they can expect at the very end of the year, things like that. And I know you also, in going back through some of the past research data at Hayes, the research center, you even found studies from the 1930s conducted by John Weaver, and you found some takeaways even from that research, right?
Yeah, John Weaver was an early pioneer of grassland studies. He was from Nebraska, but he had research that came down into Kansas. And he followed some study areas during the drought of the 1930s. And what he had found was that during extended droughts that lasted more than 1 year, the drought of the 30s was over several years, that those pastures that had a history of moderate or light use had better grass survivability 2 and 3 years after the start of the drought. So prior history or prior utilization or use of a pasture also determined grass plant survivability during those long-term droughts. So prior use history is important for setting the yield level expected from a certain pasture when rainfall returns, but it's also important for long-term droughts in grass survivability.
Absolutely. And of course, these droughts, these conditions that we've been experiencing this year, but obviously there's a history of droughts in certain decades and things of that nature. They're unforeseeable, right? We can't expect or plan for them when we can't see into the future and say, oh, we're going to have a drought, in 2027 or whatever. We can't anticipate that. But we can do things now. You mentioned before kind of putting together a plan potentially to prepare ourselves to better endure those droughts. So stocking rate, it sounds like, is a great way to kind of plan ahead, making sure you're managing those better, right?
Yeah, having a grazing management plan that utilizes your pastures to a proper moderate level so those plants are able to have leaf material that they're able to photosynthesize and produce new leaves, and they have enough energy to put sugars and carbohydrates back down into roots for root growth and into storage tissues so that they can survive dormant periods. That's all very important. And it's also important to have, as I mentioned before, a plan going through the grazing season or growing season so that if precipitation in April, May, and June does not reach the levels that is needed for the stocking rates that you have out on pasture, that you can start to implement some management strategies to reduce stocking, early weaning, just plain removing pairs on pasture, having a set of animals that are stalker animals or replacement heifers that you can pull off of pasture and either put into a lot or that you can sell and utilize those acres then for cow-calf pairs, having some flexibility. But anyway, having some sort of a plan in place that you can lessen the stocking rate to better match the forage demand from your grazing animals with the forage that's going to be produced that season.
Absolutely. We're seeing the repercussions of not having those plans in place now, I guess, going into the winter as forage availability decreases more and more as the time goes on. But you also, Keith, wrote an article covering this exact subject recently that was shared in the Beef Tips newsletter. If listeners are tuning in and they're wanting to read through that potentially, where can they find that at?
Yeah, they can find it on the K-State Animal Science Department website. There should be a link on there to the November Beef Tips.
Awesome. Well, Keith, thank you so much for your insight that you've provided today and for your time.
All right. Well, glad to be a part of this.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Keith Harmoney. He is a K-State range scientist located in Hays, sharing information about learning from droughts in not only the 1930s, but also the 1950s. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. For many, the holidays are symbolized by the Christmas tree. For some, it's an artificial tree that gets put up year after year. And for others, it's a trip to a tree farm or tree lot to pick out a fresh cut tree. If you're getting a live tree, K-State forester Charlie Barden says there's several things to consider. Charlie, we're at that time when people are thinking about buying the live Christmas tree, and as part of that, really just some things that they should know. One thing they should know is the fact that there are a number of farms across Kansas.
Yes, there certainly are. The Christmas tree farm, tree farmers are quite active here in the state.
In terms of what we should be looking for when we're going out and making that trip to the tree farm, what should we be looking for?
Well, we should be looking for trees that are healthy and dark green. If you're choosing to cut your own tree, you want one that's going to fit in your living room or fit in your area where you want to use it in the house.
Is that one thing we really need to take note of? Because I know sometimes you get out to the tree farm and something looks like it's a small tree, but it's much bigger than you think.
That's right. So you want to take some measurements or have a person standing for scale next to it so you can really see how big it is, because people sometimes bite off more than they can chew.
Also, I guess circumference comes into play as well.
Right. The width of the branches is determined in how much space it'll take up.
Are there some things in terms of needles that we need to think about? Because there are a variety of trees available.
Right. Some trees have quite prickly needles like Austrian pine and blue spruce. Others have very soft needles like white pine and some of the firs and like that.
In terms of how long a live tree will last, what can we do to make sure that it stays healthy inside the house?
Right. When you bring the tree home, you want to recut the end of it, cut off another fresh 1 inch or 2 from the trunk. That'll help release any pitch clog pores and allow it to absorb water much more easily.
We hear sometimes about putting things in the water. Is that necessary, or is it more important just to make sure that it has water?
Right. The most important thing is the water. When you bring home a tree, especially if it's off a lot that's been pre-cut, it may absorb a gallon of water that first 24-hour period, which is a lot of water. And we have found that the additives don't seem to really help the water any. There's some thought of putting a penny in the water or an aspirin or a floral preservative, and none of those things seem to make much of a difference for the tree. Just keep the tree, well watered and make sure it doesn't run out of water during the day.
And if we do that, it will make it not only through Christmas, but maybe through New Year's?
Right. A tree can stay inside the house probably for 3 weeks if it's kept well watered, and it'll keep absorbing water and keeping the needles hydrated.
You mentioned if you go to a lot, what are some things we should be checking for when we go to a lot in terms of the health of the tree?
Right. For a pre-cut tree on the lot, when you pick up the tree, it should feel kind of heavy for its size. That means it's well saturated with water, has a good high water content. You can take the tree and chunk the stump onto the ground. If a few yellow needles fall off from inside the crown, inside the branches, that's okay. But if a lot of green needles fall off, that tree has already gotten desiccated, and it might be too far gone to absorb much water and stay hydrated.
And again, because of the way they're shipped, I'm imagining that we're also going to cut off a little bit of that trunk?
Right, definitely we'll cut off that trunk. You want to, cut another 2 inches off the end of a pre-cut tree, then immediately stick it in water, just like you would a cut flower. When you cut the ends of a cut flower and put it in a vase of water, and it immediately absorbs that water.
And in terms of after the holidays, how do we ecologically get rid of those trees?
Right, there's several different ways to do that. Most cities and municipalities will collect trees after Christmas, usually the week after New Year's. They'll take those and they'll mulch them and use them in landscapes. If you're near a state park, they may be collecting the trees there to anchor in the state fishing lakes to make kind of an artificial reef for the fish habitat.
And if you're a farmer or rancher, you might be able to utilize that in your own pond.
Right, you certainly could. Just tie a cinder block on one end and tie it to the trunk of the tree and toss it in.
If somebody thinks that they would like to maybe go out and try and find a live tree this year, how can they find a lot that may be near them?
Right. The easiest way is just using your Google or internet search engine. Just enter Kansas Christmas Tree Farms, and several different sites will pop up that'll show you either the membership of the whole organization or where the individual ones are nearest to your location.
That's K-State Forester Charlie Barden with tips on selecting and caring for a live Christmas tree. For more information, contact your local county or district extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.